Hello everyone and welcome to Spring Sunday, a weekly series of family programming presented by Rockefeller Center. I am Jennifer Shahade, a chess champion and author, and today I am going to lead you through chess basics. Now, I know that all of you probably come to this with a different level of chess understanding and knowledge, but this is going to be really geared for total beginners. That said, if you already know the rules of chess and need a refresher, you also came to the right place. So to make this easier to understand, what we're going to do is we're going to take this position that you see in front of you. This is the chess starting position, and we are going to break it down piece by piece. As you can see, in this starting position, we have 16 pieces for each player, 64 squares, so 32 with pieces on it, 32 that are empty, and each player has a symmetrical position. White always goes first in chess, and the pieces that we're going to learn are the rook, the knight, the bishop, the queen, the king, and the pawns. We're going to start with the most straightforward piece. That is the rook. The rook, as I indicated, moves straight, both horizontally and vertically, as many or as few squares as it wants. So all of these squares that are shaded in green, the rook can go to right now. It is one of the most powerful pieces in chess. In fact, it's the second most powerful piece. The queen is the most powerful, and after that, we have the mighty rook. Now let's take a look at the rook and see how this piece captures. Well, the rook captures exactly how it moves. That's going to be true for every chess piece except for the pawn. So back to the rook. We already learned that the rook moves in straight lines. So if it's white's move in this position, white can simply capture this pawn in one move. But if he wants to take this pawn, it's going to take a little more time. Suppose we start by taking this pawn, and then we get the second pawn. But if we wanted to take this pawn in the fewest moves possible, note that we cannot put our rook here. And that is because the rook cannot jump over pieces. We can't jump over white pieces, and we can't jump over black pieces. That is true for every single chess piece except for one, the knight. But back to the rook and our goal of capturing this pawn. Has anybody figured out the quickest way to do that? Well, if you said rook here, followed by rook takes pawn, you were right. That took only 2 moves. All right, let's move on to one of my favorite pieces, the bishop. The bishop moves a lot like the rook, except instead of moving on the straight lines, the ranks and files, the bishop moves on the diagonal lines. This makes the bishop a really tricky piece because we're more used to seeing those straight lines. These diagonal lines can be a little easier to miss. So if opponent's bishop attacks you, it's easy not to notice it and end up losing a big piece because of it. They are also very long range pieces, so they can go from one side of the board to the other in a swoop. But just like the rook, they don't have to make a long move. They can also move just one square ahead if they want to. Now, similar to almost all of the chess pieces, the bishop also captures in a very straightforward way. It can't jump over pieces, but it can capture exactly how it moves. So right now, the white bishop can already capture one of the rooks. Can you see which one? That's right. It's this rook right here. Now, how many moves would it take to capture the other rook? If you said 2, that's right. Bishop can go here, and then next move, take. Now, I should point out we're doing all of these exercises for instructional purposes, right? So you can never make two moves at once in a chess game. It's always my turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. Right now, we're doing this so that you can get more comfortable with how the pieces move. But when you're playing against someone else, that doesn't happen, that you can make two moves to capture your opponent's pieces. They wouldn't be very happy with that. Okay, let's go over another bishop movement. How does this bishop, how many moves does it take this bishop to take this pawn? Now, take your time with this one. I'll give you a couple seconds from now so that if you want to pause, you can do that. Well, those of you who said that it was a trick question, we're absolutely right. It is impossible for this bishop to get this pawn. This bishop can only be on the dark square. So the only way we could get this pawn is if it moved to a dark square. Right now on this square, it's simply impossible. And that is one thing that makes the bishops a little bit weaker than they would be if they could switch colors. Because they're only able to control one side of the board, either the dark squares or the light squares, unlike the rook, which can go to any square. So bishops, very powerful, but they're limited by only being able to control half the board. Next piece, the queen. The queen, as you might know, is the most powerful piece in chess. She can move as many squares as she wants, horizontally, vertically, and diagonally. And that makes her an exact combination of the bishop and the rook. So the bishop moves on the diagonals and the rook moves on horizontal and vertical lines. The queen can do all three. So this green arrows show all the different squares that the queen can move right now. Like the bishop and the rook, it can also move just one square if it wants to. And that brings us to a very interesting historical aside. Before the 1500s, the queen was actually the weakest piece in the board. So it went from being the weakest to the powerhouse of the board, so much so that when the rules changed to make the queen the most powerful piece, at first it was called the Crazy Woman's Chess Game. And that Crazy Woman's Chess Game became chess as we know it. The game before this powerful queen took so long that people wanted to speed it up, and the way they did it was by empowering the queen. Very strong life metaphors there. But let's move on to see how this powerful queen captures. Well, just like the other pieces we reviewed, the queen captures in the same way that it moves. So which piece can the queen capture right now? That's right, another trick question. The answer is both. The queen can capture the rook on the diagonal or the bishop in the straight line. I think I would start with the rook and then come back and take the bishop. Next up is one of the favorite pieces of chess players, and that is the knight, because the knight moves unlike any other piece. It moves in a small L. So look at all these green squares. These are all the squares that the knight can move to. We move 2 squares up and 1 square to the right or to the left, or 1 square up or down and 2 squares to the left or right. So you can see the knight can move to all 8 squares here that we have shaded in green in that little L shape pattern. Another very important thing about the knight is that it can jump over pieces, either the opponent's pieces or its own, but it does not capture a piece that it jumps over. So for instance, in this position, the knight can move to all of these green shaded squares, including this one, but it would not capture the pawn when going to that square. Whereas if you take another, let's say, white piece in this position, it could capture, let's say a rook, it could move around the pawns, but it cannot jump over them. Only the knight can jump over other pieces. Now let's take a look at how the knight captures. And to do that, I want to ask you a question. how many moves would it take for this white knight to capture this black rook? Well, if you said 4, you got it right. 1, 2, 3, 4. And there were other ways to do that too. If you had a different idea in mind, you could also go here and then take this. There are different routes to the same reward. Let's take another example. How many squares does it take, how many moves rather, does it take for this knight to capture this rook? Okay, well, if you said the number 5 and you got it right. Now this one's a little bit trickier. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice that every time the knight moves, it switches color. So that's the nature of the knight movement. So if you're wondering if you're making a knight move that's right or wrong, that's one clue, right? It's always switching from a white square to a dark square. And that is because of this L movement, 2, 1, or 1, 2. Next up, we have the pawn, which is really the trickiest piece for a lot of people to learn. And the reason for that is that the pawn moves differently than it captures. So it moves in a very straightforward way. It moves straight ahead, can't jump over pieces. It moves one square at a time, except on the very first time it moves, it has the option to move 2 squares. So I can move 2 squares, and black at the same point can move his pawn 1 square, or since it's the first move, he can also move it 2. But let's say he moves it 1, and then I move mine 1. The cool thing here is that this is actually a standstill. I can't move forward, and they can't move forward, and that is because the pawn captures differently than it moves. And we'll take a look at how that works in this next one. You see that if I want to move my pawn 2 squares and my opponent moves it 1 square and I move it 1 square, now we have a position where we will show you how the pawn captures. The pawn captures 1 square diagonally. So if there's anything here or anything here, the black pawn can capture it. So right now, this black pawn could capture the white pawn. It could also just choose to go forward. And then again, we have that standstill where nothing can take nothing, because nothing can take anything rather, because we can't capture forward, and neither can this one capture forward. So instead, after captures, white will also capture most likely, and then we'll have that standoff yet again. The pawns are called the souls of chess. The soul of chess, because they really define the speed of the game. They make way for the different pieces, and they determine whether a pawn structure is going to be static, where you're not able to really move anything, or totally dynamic, where there are lots of potential pawn captures and everything is very fluid. Now that's an advanced concept, but you can understand why they're considered the soul of chess, because they determine what type of chess game you're going to get. Now let's do just a little bit of practice with the pawn. Let's try to use this pawn to capture this knight. Now I should point out to those of you who already know a little chess that we never get to make more than 1 move in a row in chess, and if we did, we would win every game, right? But let's just do this one for practice, because I do want to show everyone another special rule of chess. If it was black's move here, we should review that the knight could capture this pawn, but instead we're playing the game where I get to make all these moves in a row. So I will instead move forward, and now can you see how I can capture? That's right, I can capture this knight, but even better, you may wonder what happens when I get to that final row, because there's no more places for me to move forward. Unlike other pieces, the pawns cannot move backwards. So what happens when it gets to the end of the board? Well, I have good news for you, and especially good news for pawns, that when they get to the end of the board, in this case by capturing a knight, when they get to this last rank, as we call it, they become whatever piece they want to be. except the king. So they can become a rook, a knight, a bishop, or 99% of the time, they choose to become a queen. And that is because she is the most powerful piece. So that's the dream of every pawn, to become a queen. Now, you're maybe wondering why I left the king for last. Actually, the king is a straightforward piece. It moves just one square in each direction, much like the queen, except a very slow queen. So sometimes when I teach little kids, I explain that the king had too many donuts for breakfast and they can't run. They're a very slow moving piece. And this really makes the game quite interesting because the whole goal of chess, and you've probably heard this phrase before, is to checkmate your opponent. What checkmating means that you're attacking your opponent's king and your opponent cannot get out of the attack. Because the king can't move quickly, it becomes easier and easier to do that as you corner the king. So here we see the king movement. It can go to all of these green squares. Now, let's take a look and see how the king captures. Well, the king captures just like it moves, so it can go right up to the king, right up to the knight rather, and capture it. But here's the thing. Unlike the other pieces, the king cannot be captured. And that's because if the king is dead, if the king is mated, as we say, the game is over. It's checkmate. So whenever we attack the king, we have to warn it. So this move right now attacks the king because the rook moves straight forward and the king is right on that straight line with nothing obstructing it. This is called a check. And when you do attack your king, especially when you're starting out, you should do your opponent a favor and say check so that they know. Then your opponent must get out of check. And there's 3 different ways to do that. They can flee, which means they just move their king away from any check. Notice that I use these 3 squares. That's because if I move my king forward or onto this line, I would still be in check. And I am not allowed to do that. I am not allowed to leave my king in check. That's a key rule of chess. Another way to get out of check is to capture the offending piece. And that's actually a good way. So I say, yummy. Finally, I can block. So I can put my bishop in between the line of fire. So that is how check works. Now let's take a look and see how we can checkmate. Checkmate is when you put me in a check, and this time I can't capture because my king's way too far away. It only moves 1 square at a time. I can't block because I don't have any pieces to block with. And I can't come over here because you're fencing me in with your other rook. So this is a checkmate. And for those of you watching this, I wish you many checkmates. And this double rook mate may be one of your first mates. But before we move on, let's go on and talk about the beginning of the game and the quickest checkmate possible. So I showed you a checkmate with no pieces on the board. Now let's take a look at, or with very few pieces on the board. Now let's take a look at a checkmate with all the pieces on the board. The first one we're going to talk about is the fool's mate, and it starts with us moving a pawn 2 squares ahead, moving another pawn 2 squares ahead, and then, do you see the checkmate for black? There it is. The queen comes in, gives checkmate to the king because there's no way to block. These pawns have been pushed forward, so we're not able to use them to block the check. We can't flee because all these squares are taken up by other pieces. You don't share squares in chess. And this square right here is still on the diagonal of the queen, and that is why it is checkmate. That is the rules of chess. I taught you how all of the pieces move, how the pawns capture, remember, different than they move. And we talked about the trickiest piece, the knight, the only one that jumps over other pieces. And finally, the way to win the game, which is to check your opponent and to make it so that they can't get out of check. Right now, you know pretty much all the rules of chess except for a few special ones that we could go to next time, or that you can look up online, and those would be called castling and en passant and stalemate. But for now, I really encourage you to take what you learn, the basic piece movements in check and checkmate, and try to play a game with a friend or a family member. Chess is an ideal activity to practice when you're spending a lot of time at home with your loved ones, or just a lot of time alone. And that is because you can play chess over the board to strengthen your relationships, and you can also play it online with people from all over the world and also your friends. So that will really help. Live chess is a great way to bond with people and get away from too much screen time. Online chess is a great way to reinforce the rules that you just learned, because there will be a little beeping noise if you make a move that's not allowed. Like if I try to move this knight over here, my computer will beep at me. You can't do that. So I recommend both formats so that you can learn this game, which takes an afternoon to learn and a lifetime to master. Thank you very much for listening. I am Jennifer Shahade, and this was Spring Sunday, presented by Rockefeller Center with Never Stop Learning. Bye, guys.